Welcome to Celebrating Act Two. Celebrating Act Two is the user manual for the second half of your life.
Welcome back to Celebrating Act Two. I'm here with favorite people, my partner, John Coleman,
Hi there.
and Professor Manny Pacheco. Professor,
Professor of
Professor
Entertainment, I think, is the
to
proper term.
Hollywood,
I
The
think
our
I'm closer to
Hollywood
Irwin
historian.
Corey than anybody else, right?
right?
So Manny, you mentioned something to me, which we'll deal with in a when we have more time. You mentioned TCM Somewhere Under the Stars, and I looked up what the list of stars they're going to do. They're going to feature all the movies of about, I don't know, 30 stars. Great names. I mean, it's I might not go out to the beach in all of August just to see these movies. But two names stuck out at me as I was reading the list, and they were they were kind of extremes. One was George Raft, who was a great tough guy. He was in a lot of film noirs, and they always wore a hat back then. Oh, he's a tough guy, and he would. But the other was a very different kind of tough guy. It was Steve McQueen, and I thought to myself, boy, we got to talk to Manny about George Raft and Steve McQueen and the difference between tough guys of George Raft was in the 30s mostly, right?
Hmm.
And Steve McQueen came to light in the 50s, 60s, really 60s
Right.
and 70s. Had a long career, but they both had long careers, but two totally different um, cultures of tough guys.
Well, one was carved out of Warner Brothers. George Raft came out of that great gangster image that was created not only by George Raft, but by Paul Muni, James Cagney, Edward G.
Yes.
Robinson,
Yeah,
and Humphrey Bogart. But George Raft, even though he did have real ties to the mafia,
he
uh,
did.
yeah, oh yeah, he was friends with folks from Murder Incorporated.
Whoa.
In real life, was really a very soft-spoken, very polite, very genteel kind of guy, much like Boris Karloff was when he didn't play a monster. But on screen, he had this, chiseled jaw, this granite look, this granite stare he had,
Yeah.
and he knew how to throw a punch if he had to. I just the other evening got a chance to see him and Humphrey Bogart, and they Drive by Night, which is this nifty little
Ooh,
noir from 1941.
great movie.
A
Great movie.
great movie, underrated, and he plays this tough, no nonsense kind of guy. Always, is on the right side of the law, but isn't afraid to scuffle a little bit. And
Yeah.
that was just the Warner Brothers formula for success, and they played it very well for 2 decades. They were very, very strong.
Yeah. And that was the era when the studios, when they had a good thing, they had a star that worked in a particular format or formula, they would find more for them. And
Yeah.
they would do more. Kind of like what television does today with sitcom stars. If you're going to always look for a new feature, a new vehicle for your stars that make you a
Right.
lot of money.
Let me
But
mention one more thing though about George Raft that, yeah,
yeah,
before I forget, because this is really important. As important as he was as a gangster on screen, what he didn't do actually created an entirely fabulous persona for another actor, and that was Humphrey Bogart. It was George Raft who turned down the opportunity to do High Sierra, which was really the movie that gave and elevated Humphrey Bogart to the A-list category of stars. It was George Raft who turned down The Maltese Falcon. It was George
really.
Raft who turned down initially Casablanca. He turned
Wow.
down more great films than movies he made.
But he was like a casting agent. He was like
He
an
was.
agent for Bogart.
It's and he and Bogart were really good friends.
Did he
So
also turn down Bacall? I mean, how
yeah,
complete?
I know, I know, I know.
Right. He
I
didn't
don't
have
think he
that
had that
opportunity.
opportunity, but
Right.
No, I don't think. But if there were two individuals that really crafted Humphrey Bogart's career, one would be Leslie Howard by insisting that he appear in the Petrified Forest, the film version, because he had been so good in the Broadway version, and George Rapp turning down all of these tough guy parts that Bogart turned into iconic roles for himself.
Why do you suppose George Raft turned those particular roles down? Was he too busy, or was there something about those roles that he didn't like?
He was very good at making poor choices. He would make these forgettable films that I can't even name because they're that forgettable. Because he thought they would be better than let's say the Maltese Falcon. Because at the time,
Yeah,
who was John Huston? Who was this guy? He's an up and coming director. What?
yeah,
I'm not going to make a film for an up. I'm going to work with Michael Curtiz. Why
yeah.
would I work for Houston?
That's
You know?
interesting because Raft really never achieved the stardom
No.
uh, that uh, Bogart did, and I'm one of those people who loves not the Raft was unknown. He was a star when in his own right, made a million pictures, but he was really kind of a he starred in B movies. What
Right.
today we look at as B movies.
Right.
Um, and the movies that Bogart starred in were B movies that became A movies to us today.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so you're right about Raft not making
O-
great
Okay,
choices.
so
Oh.
Steve McQueen wasn't chopped liver either.
Yeah,
No. No.
Maybe it's
I
different,
he
but
made
enough with George. Okay, took care of George. Okay, but Bullet and The Great Escape. Okay,
yes,
we're talking about a different my era kind of tough guy.
yeah,
How,
different tough guy altogether. Yeah,
how did Steve
I
McQueen become a tough guy?
I have a different perspective. I don't see Steve McQueen as a tough guy. I see him as an icon of cool. Like he's a cool guy. But you can convince me that he did play tough guy parts. I mean, obviously, the Magnificent Seven. I mean, it's a bevy of tough guys. We have
yeah,
a
yeah,
lot of tough guys in the Magnificent Seven and the Great Escape. I mean, these guys not only were tough, they were survivors
yeah.
based on a
But
true story. I mean, absolutely. But I guess you know what? If you mention Bullet, how do you not say he's not a tough guy?
right, right. But it's interesting. It was cool. He was a cool tough guy. But there was behind the coolness, behind the George Raft could threaten you with words and look threatening, but Steve McQueen didn't use a lot of words. He would give you the look, and it was a steely look. And if he said something, you knew there was a threat behind it. You knew that he could carry it out.
Yes, yeah, and but he seldom did on screen. You just knew that the threat was there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
His,
there's
yeah, and you're right. He wasn't a tough guy in the sense of a lot of fisticuffs
no.
or guns or things like that. He was the tough guy who drove the fast car.
Well, like James Garner or Paul Newman. He
Yeah,
was he wasn't a Lee Marvin tough guy. He wasn't a Warren Oates tough guy. He wasn't a Peckinpah tough guy.
right.
He wasn't tough in that sense. He just did things that men do.
Yeah,
I think driving race cars is a great example.
But also
Uh,
you had people like Clint Eastwood. Okay, are you
yes,
feeling lucky, punk?
yeah,
Okay, he was a pretty tough guy, and then a sort of
sure,
transitional guy who was nothing but fierce, Charles Bronson. Okay,
absolutely.
he was
Yeah.
Mr. Fierce. So how do all these guys fit in? Like there was a changing look to tough.
Yeah, and you know who I think brought it in of all people? I think the Brits did that. I think they were better at bringing in that whole steely, cool, tough guy look of the 60s. If you think
really.
Richard Burton or Robert Shaw, I mean, these
Yeah,
guys that were, Oliver Reed, these
yep,
were really streetwise, tough hooligans who didn't necessarily have to throw a punch, but they knew how to drink and they knew how to drive fast cars. I mean, Sean Connery as Bond. I mean, did he have to fight all the time? No.
yeah,
As long as you get the girl in the way you get the girl. I mean, it's got to be done your way. And that was Steve McQueen's way. He was very much his own man on screen.
yeah,
And even when he negotiated for films, here's a funny story. You want to talk about tough. In the making of the Towering Inferno, he has way less screen time than Paul Newman, but he says, if you want me, I got to have top billing. And of course, Paul Newman was a nice guy, but the way they worked this out is they had Steve McQueen first and then Paul Newman. But if you look at the poster, Paul Newman's name is higher up, Steve McQueen's is lower down, but his is first. So that's how they worked out that deal.
Yeah. Well, we could have an hour-long discussion on how they negotiate credits in Hollywood.
But
And we could
that's a
Another.
also we'll
that's a
also have a
different kind of
great conversation, probably not today, about how many of these people then wound up doing softer stories like Love Story.
Yeah.
I guess Steve McQueen didn't Steve McQueen had a romantic thing after he was done, but
well, he
certainly
did a
most of these others. James Cagney, he went back to his Broadway roots, and after being a tough guy, he did Yankee Doodle Dandy,
right.
Yeah.
Well,
or I was it the other way around.
one of Steve McQueen's way of being soft was that he plays a rodeo guy, which is really kind of a tough guy in a very tender movie called Junior Bonner. So yeah, he could even if you see him in The Blob, I mean he's kind of a romantic. He's a romantic lead. I mean, it just happens that the villain happens to be red and looks like Jello, but he was that's a romantic lead for him. So yeah, he
Yeah.
can he can play the soft hearted
Comparatively
character.
speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, but he did it his own way. I mean, again, riding, bucking broncos and driving race cars and hard drinking. He only lived to be 50, but those were 50 fast years for
Oh
Steve.
boy. Yeah. He was a legend off the screen as well. You're right.
Yes, he was.
But they
Yeah,
were different eras. They were different eras, as you point out. It was the Warner Brothers era of gangsters versus the Steve McQueen era of a different kind of tough guy,
right.
and different kinds of films. Steve McQueen wasn't never played a gangster that I can recall.
No, I don't
Yeah,
remember
Um,
ever playing a
he
gangster.
was always the independent lone wolf.
The
Uh,
loner. Yeah, that's
that
a
I,
great way to describe Steve McQueen, and that's the way he was in his personal life.
yeah,
To a person, anybody who ever dated Steve McQueen says they really never got to know the man. So
great insights.
yeah,
Appreciate it. As always, this has been a lot of fun talking about movies and movie stars. Manny, give us your website.
ForgottenHollywood.com, and of course we have an ever-growing list of great interviews, not only with about Hollywood history, but you have such a vast array of different interviews that would, of course, entertain those big fans of Celebrating Act Two.
And
Great.
speaking of which, nice lead in. Thank you, Manny. That if people want to binge watch you, they get up at 1 o'clock in the morning and say, "I'm not watching Law." What else is there to do? They can go to YouTube/ Celebrating Act Two and subscribe because we're a wonderful place to subscribe to, and then Manny's Forgotten Hollywood playlist and
Yep.
binge watch you. They could take them right up to the.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Manny, and always great to see you. To speak.
You bet.
For more on Celebrating Act Two, visit our webpage, follow us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and tell your friends. Celebrating Act Two is the user manual for the second half of your life.